Story number 14. In the humid Philippine nights, where mango trees whispered under a golden moon, something watched from the darkness. Lena's childhood bedroom, perched on the second floor, was a sanctuary shared with her younger brother. The room, split by a removable wooden divider, opened to a hallway, its silver-framed windows catching the northern breeze. But one night, with the divider gone and the air heavy, Lena woke to a jolt, her eyes open, unsure why. Two faint, unblinking red dots hung outside the northern window, perfectly spaced like eyes. And in that moment, the stillness of her home became a trap, the night alive with dread. The eyes weren't human, weren't animal. They were wrong. Lena lay frozen, her heart a drum against her ribs, pretending she hadn't seen them. The room, usually cooled by the northern wind, felt suffocating, the cicadas' hum a distant echo. Her brother slept in his blue-sheeted bed, oblivious, while Lena stared at the ceiling, willing sleep to return. But the red dots burned in her mind, unwavering, watching. She shut her eyes, fear settling like fog in her chest, and waited for dawn's light to banish them. The morning offered no answers. At breakfast, Lena told her parents, her voice small. Her mother smiled, blaming the control panel in their room, its red switches reflecting off the window. It seemed plausible. Their room faced hers, the divider's absence changing the angles. Lena believed her for a while. The family fled to her grandparents for a week, where laughter and dusty games pushed the eyes from her mind. But when they returned, the jolt woke her again, the same invisible alarm pulling her from sleep. The night was heavy, the mango trees silent, and dread crept back. She turned, eyes barely open, and saw them again. Two glowing red dots, watching. This time, Lena rose, her fear battling her resolve. She crossed the room, whispering for warm milk. Her mother, patient, led her downstairs, then showed her the panel, two red switches for their phones. She flicked them off, and the red eyes vanished. "You have such a big imagination," she said, kissing Lena's forehead. Lena wanted to believe it was solved, that the eyes were just lights. But the house felt different now, its shadows sharper, its silence deeper. The illusion shattered weeks later. Lena woke again. The same jolt, the same dread. She turned to the window, and the red eyes were back. But this time, she checked her parents' room. The panel's lights were off, every switch dark. Her breath caught. If the lights were off, what were those eyes? The mango trees loomed outside, their branches clawing at the sky, but nothing moved. The eyes, unblinking, held her gaze, a silent challenge. Lena didn't scream, didn't wake her brother. She lay still, trapped in the gaze of something beyond her world. The house, once a haven, became a puzzle Lena couldn't solve. Her parent dismissed it as imagination, but Lena knew better. The eyes weren't reflections. They were deliberate, tied to the night itself. She began closing the windows, even in the heat. The northern breeze, a risk she wouldn't take. Her brother, young and carefree, noticed her tension but never saw the eyes. Lena searched for stories in the village, tales of spirits in the trees, of lights that watched, but found no answers. The mango trees, so close to her window, felt like guardians now, or maybe sentinels for something else. Years later, Lena carried the memory like a weight. She'd left that house, but the eyes followed her in quiet moments, a flicker at the edge of her dreams. Her parents never saw them, never felt the jolt. She read about folklore, Dewata, Encanto, spirits of the land, but none matched the red-eyed stare. The control panel, a logical excuse, couldn't explain that final night. Lena kept her curtains drawn now, her bedroom a fortress against the dark. The village's stories grew louder in her mind, whispers of things that watched from the trees, waiting for those who looked too long. The Philippines' summers remained golden, but Lena saw them differently. She avoided mango trees at night, their shadows too alive. Her brother, now grown, teased her caution, but she never told him why. The house stood unchanged, its windows still facing the orchard, but Lena never returned. The red eyes were a mystery, a scar from childhood that no explanation could erase. They weren't lights, weren't dreams. They were something else, something that chose her and her alone to see. Story number 15. The destroyer cut through the Pacific's dark waves, its steel hull a fortress against the night. Gavin, a young sailor, stood watch on the flight deck, the ocean's rhythm a lullaby under the stars. But the air was wrong tonight, heavy with a salt-stung chill that wasn't just the sea. Something stirred in the shadows, a presence older than the ship, watching from the edges. Gavin's headset crackled, but no voice came through, only silence and the faint echo of a name. Flight Deck Mike. Gavin gripped the railing, his eyes scanning the horizon. The flight deck stretched empty, its surface gleaming under dim deck lights. Then a flicker, a shape, tall and lean, moving near the OD station's door. It wasn't a sailor, wasn't a trick of the light. It was a man, or something like one, in a faded Navy uniform. His face blurred, his eyes hollow. The air grew thick, the waves' song drowned by a low hum, like a memory trying to speak. Gavin's breath caught, his heart a drum against his ribs. The figure didn't move closer, but it didn't need to. Its presence was a weight, pressing against his mind. 3 sharp thuds echoed from the station's wall, deliberate, like a signal from another time. Gavin called out, his voice swallowed by the night, but the figure only tilted its head, as if listening to something Gavin couldn't hear. The ship was alive, and it wasn't alone. The thuds came again, louder, each one a pulse in the dark. Gavin backed toward the station, his boots scraping the deck. The figure flickered, its outline fraying like smoke, but its eyes stayed fixed, burning with a grief that wasn't Gavin's. Images flashed in his mind, gunfire, screams, a deck slick with the blood, a war long ended. The ship was telling a story, and Flight Deck Mike was its voice. A ghost bound to steal and see. Gavin stumbled into the OD station, the door slamming shut behind him. The thuds stopped, but the air vibrated, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. He checked his headset, his watch, anything to anchor him to the present, but the ship felt older, its walls whispering of battles fought and lives lost. Flight Deck Mike wasn't a prank, wasn't a myth. He was real, and he wanted Gavin to know. Gavin was new to the Navy, an active duty enlisted sailor, just shy of 2 years, stationed on the southwestern coast. He kept his ship's name and location anonymous, but it was a destroyer. The ship was his world, a maze of steel and routine made to go out to sea. His command was gearing up for a home port change, going underway for weeks at a time. Most recent underways involved going a reasonable distance from the pier, doing business as usual, making big circles in the ocean. They went for weeks to months with safe voyaging. Aside from seasickness for some, Gavin's division conducted safety drills and worst-case scenario exercises. He'd heard ghost stories, listening to tales from shipmates, but hadn't seen hauntings himself. He had no reason to doubt their tales except the belief they were taunting him, but no real reason to believe either. His division told him about a spirit named Flight Deck Mike. Though he had little information on who he was or why he stuck around, he thought it was a hoax to spook him. But when officers and other divisions mentioned him, he started questioning. The name echoed. A legend woven into the ship's steel, possibly tied to a sailor like Paul Spampanato, who died of a heart attack on a destroyer like the U.S. Edson in 90, a little over a week ago. While underway, Gavin saw something that made him realize Flight Deck Mike wasn't a hoax. He saw something that terrified him. His job included standing watch topside, on the weather decks. Everyone on the ship stood watch, and his rate stood watch on the flight deck. From midnight till 6, he was at the aftmost part of the flight deck, looking for ships, marine life, or irregularities, communicating over headset. It was his favorite time, dark and calm, with waves hitting the ship. He rotated to the OD station, a little shack attached to the ship, windowless, with one door to the flight deck, cramped with alarms, a phone, and one metal chair. Gavin settled into the station, the ocean's rhythm soothing his exhaustion. After staring at the ocean's waves, he noticed something creep around the top right of the doorframe, catching his eye briefly in the dark. He was sure his eyes were playing tricks. He assured himself nothing was there, but a gentle thudding noise echoed across the station's wall. He held his breath, his heartbeat rising into his throat. No more than a few seconds later, his relief jumped into the doorway with a light stomp and a goofy expression. Gavin yelled his name, telling him how he'd scared him while he laughed. They exchanged small talk, and Gavin had a mediocre breakfast and hit his rack. The scare was a prank, but it planted a seed of doubt. 2 days later, Gavin stood his 12 to 6 watch again. Earlier that day, a younger girl on the ship said she saw a figure in the cameras the night before. She seemed shaken up, but people didn't believe her or chalked it up to Flight Deck Mike. After weeks at sea with little sleep and too much caffeine, Gavin hoped it was her imagination. The crew was frayed, exhaustion blurring the line between reality and hallucination, but the girl's fear lingered in his mind. At 1:15, Gavin was at the OD station, leaning against the bulkhead, looking at the sky. The stars were scarce, the moon not visible, the faint glow from the phone and alarms the only light. Out of the corner of his eye, there was movement near the top right of the doorframe, the outline of a head peering in. He yelled his buddy's name, sure he was trying to scare him again, but was met with silence. He glanced at his watch, feeling worry, as it was only 25 after 1, his relief not due for 30 minutes. Nobody was allowed to walk the weather decks at night. Anything needed had to be done in court or wait until morning. The air grew colder, the ship's hum turning to a low, mournful drone. Gavin stared at the doorway, where the figure stood. Not a prank, but a shadow in a tattered uniform, its edges fraying like smoke. 3 loud thuds shook the station's wall, each one a hammer to Gavin's nerves. The figure moved closer, its form filling the door, its eyes carrying a weight of loss and longing. Gavin pressed against the corner, his voice gone, as the ship whispered memories of war, explosions, shouts, a sailor's last breath. A loud thud or banging sound on the station's wall buoyant, happening twice more, pounding Gavin's eardrums, a lump forming in his throat. The longer he looked, the closer it seemed to get. He shuffled to the corner of the station, the only place he could move, silent and frozen. It engulfed the entire doorframe, looking as if it were walking into the station. He checked his watch, noticing 3 whole minutes had gone by. With a loud scratching sound and one final thud, the black figure dissipated instantly. It was gone, vanished. Gavin muttered into the headset that he could have sworn someone was out there. The remainder of his watch, he was shaking, talking to his division to calm down, but it didn't work well. He struggled to sleep afterward, even as tired as he was. The encounter changed Gavin. It wasn't the scariest story, but being cornered on the ship in the middle of the sea rattled him for days. The ship felt different now, its steel alive with echoes of the past. He began asking around, piecing together stories of flight deck Mike. Some said he was a sailor who died during a battle, perhaps in World War II, like those on the USS Stewart, caught in the chaos of the Pacific War. Others whispered he was like Paul Spampanato, lost to a heart attack, his spirit tied to the deck where he served. The stories varied, but the feeling was the same, a presence that didn't harm, but demanded to be seen. Gavin's nights on watch became a vigil, his eyes scanning not just for ships, but for shadows. The OD station, once a refuge, felt like a stage for Mike's ritual. He saw flashes in his mind, torpedoes tearing through water, sailors running across the deck, a man collapsing under the weight of duty. The thuds weren't just sounds, they were cries, a sailor's attempt to reach across time. Gavin began to notice small signs, the creak of a hatch when no one was there, the flicker of a light in an empty passageway, the dogs on board staring at the flight deck's edge. He researched in his downtime, finding tales of haunted Navy ships. The U.S. Edson, a destroyer like his, was known for sightings of a sailor named Paul, felt as tugs on clothing or footsteps in empty corridors. The USS Hornet, too, carried ghosts of sailors lost to accidents in war, their spirits lingering in the steel. Gavin wondered if Mike was like them, a soul bound to the ship, replaying his final moments, seeking acknowledgement. The destroyer's history was long, its decks soaked in the sweat and blood of countless sailors, and Mike was one of them. His story unfinished. Gavin stood his next watch with a mix of dread and resolve. The flight deck was a sea of shadows, the ocean's waves a low chant. He felt Mike before he saw him, a chill, a hum, then the figure again, standing at the deck's edge, staring out to sea. The thuds came, 3, then a scratch, like a hand clawing at steel. Gavin didn't run. He whispered, "I see you, Mike," and the air lightened. The figure faded. The ship was quiet. But Gavin knew Mike was still there, waiting for the next sailor to listen. Gavin never saw Mike again, but the ship carried his weight. He was glad it left him alone after that. He shared his story with a few trusted shipmates who nodded, their own tales of Mike surfacing, footsteps on the deck, a shadow in the engine room, a voice in the wind. The destroyer was more than steel. It was a vessel for memories, for souls like Mike who couldn't leave. Gavin's watches became a silent pact, an acknowledgement of the unseen sailor who shared the deck. His knocks a call from a war that never truly ended. Story number 16. The old house stood on 10 acres of North Carolina soil, its tin roof glinting under the summer sun. Daniel and his girlfriend, Mariah, had come to clean it out, a task left by Daniel's great-aunt after her passing. The place was a relic. Built in 91, its brown siding cracked and its shag carpet a faded memory of better days. Their dog, a sharp-eyed Australian shepherd named Blue, padded behind them, but stopped dead at the living room threshold, his hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Daniel tugged at Blue's collar, but the dog wouldn't budge, his eyes fixed on the room's shadowed corners. Maria, her faith as unyielding as the crosses on every mantel, frowned but said nothing. The house was a shrine to Pentecostalism, nativity sets year-round, angels on the walls, Bibles on every table. Yet the air felt heavy, not holy, as if the walls held secrets older than the faith they displayed. Blue's refusal to enter the living room was the first sign something was wrong. That night, Daniel lay awake, Maria's breathing soft beside him. Blue curled at the bed's foot, stirred, his ears twitching. Then it came, a sharp clatter from the kitchen, like metal striking wood. Daniel's heart jumped, but he stayed still, listening. Another crash followed, louder, deliberate. Blue's growl deepened, his eyes locked on the bedroom door, beyond which the house lay dark and silent. Daniel gripped Maria's hand, the darkness pressing in, live with intent. The next night, it happened again. Blue's growls woke them, his body rigid, staring into the pitch-black hall. Daniel rose, flashlight in hand, and checked the house. The doors were locked, the windows sealed, but in the living room, every nativity scene, 6 in all, had been turned, their porcelain figures facing the bedroom door. Maria's gasp echoed Daniel's shock. Worse, the baby Jesus figurines were gone, leaving empty mangers. The house felt like it was watching, waiting. Daniel accused Maria of playing a prank, his voice sharp with fear. She denied it, her eyes red, and their argument spiraled, fueled by the house's oppressive air. Blue stayed silent, his gaze never leaving the living room. Daniel's skepticism battled his unease. But the house was old, drafty, surely that explained it. Yet, as the days passed, the tension grew, the couple's trust fraying under the weight of something neither could name. Daniel and Maria had come to the house after his great-aunt passed away, tasked with clearing it for sale to spare his grandmother the burden. The house, built in 1901, was a time capsule of faith and decay. Its brown shag carpet and pine floors steeped in history. Every mantel held crosses, every table a Bible, the remnants of his aunt's Pentecostal devotion. Daniel, raised Catholic but long drifted from religion, felt out of place, while Maria's Catholicism kept her grounded, wary of anything that hinted at the occult. Blue, their Australian shepherd, set the tone from the start. He refused to enter the living room, planting himself in the kitchen or master bedroom, his fur bristling whenever they neared the room's threshold. Daniel tried a pinch collar to coax him through, but Blue went limp, his barks sharp with fear. The couple brushed it off at first, blaming the dog's age or the house's strangeness, but the normalcy of their first month began to crack. About a month in, Blue started growling every night, his eyes fixed on the dark, Pots fell from cabinets, clattering to the floor without cause. Daniel, ever the skeptic, blamed the house's age, warped windows, loose shelves, but the incidents piled up, each one chipping away at his logic. Maria grew tense, her prayers more frequent, her sleep restless. Their arguments flared, accusations flying as paranoia took hold. Daniel stayed up, watching Maria sleep, half convinced she was behind it. One night, Blue shrieked, a sound so raw it tore them from sleep. He was on the bed, barking at the bedroom door, the darkness beyond impenetrable. Daniel searched the house, finding nothing amiss until he reached the living room. Every nativity scene, 6 in the living room and 4 in the kitchen, had been turned, their figures staring toward the bedroom. The baby Jesus figurines were missing, the empty mangers a silent accusation. Daniel's anger boiled over, but Maria's fear was real, her denials desperate. Determined to catch the culprit, Daniel borrowed trail cameras from his cousin and hid a tape recorder used for his college classes. He set one camera outside the front door, another behind the living room recliner, facing the bedroom, and tucked the recorder in a drawer. For days, nothing happened, the house holding its breath. Maria, shaken, decided to leave early for their new apartment in New York, her bags packed after a particularly bad night. That night, alone with the Blue, Daniel woke to a crash. The house was cold, unnaturally so for a Carolina summer. Blue was under the bed, whimpering, a sound Daniel had never heard from him. In the living room, Daniel found the dog staring at the fireplace, still as stone. He tried to move him, but Blue snapped at him, his teeth grazing Daniel's hand. Shocked, Daniel retreated, leaving Blue to his vigil, the house's silence heavier than ever. The next night brought worse. A rocking chair in the living room moved on its own, its creaks slow and deliberate. Daniel stared, frozen, as it rocked faster, then stopped. He checked the house, finding nothing, but the air felt charged, like a storm about to break. The following night, a sound like a bobcat screaming tore through the darkness outside. Daniel, familiar with the sound from childhood, grabbed his aunt's double-barreled 12-gauge from the closet. He fired a shot into the ground, hoping to scare it off. But the screams multiplied, coming from every direction, a chorus of unseen threats. Daniel retreated, clutching the shotgun, Blue finally stirring to sit beside him. The screams lasted hours, unrelenting, until dawn broke. Exhausted, Daniel packed up, taking Blue to his grandmother's house an hour away. There, he told her about the month's horrors. Her face paled as she handed him a 1940s detective magazine. The house's previous owner, a woman before his great-grandparents, had killed her husband, dismembering him and burning his body in the fireplace except for his head, found under the living room floorboards back in New York. Daniel's cousin called, asking about trail camera photos from the house. The images showed nothing unusual, no orbs, no figures, until the last few, taken after Maria left. They captured Daniel with the shotgun, then an empty frame. The motion sensor triggered with no visible cause. The tape recorder was worse. Most recordings held only mundane sounds, falling pots, Blue's barks, their arguments. But one, from the night Maria left, was different. After Daniel stepped outside, Blue growled, followed by a screeching sound. Slowed down. It revealed a voice, deep, guttural, inhuman. I am here. I am you. No God. Daniel played the tape for Maria, her face ashen. They buried it in a shoebox, vowing never to speak of it. The house was sold, its secrets left behind, but the voice lingered in Daniel's dreams, a reminder of a place where faith and fear collided. He never returned, the fireplace's shadow, a warning he'd never forget. Story number 9. The highway stretched endlessly into the darkening desert, a ribbon of asphalt swallowed by twilight. Clara, a 23-year-old artist, was driving home to northern New Mexico after a weekend in Boulder. The route was familiar, the long drive a comfort until she stopped for gas in Alamosa, the last town before the desolate 90-mile stretch to home. The sky bruised purple as she pulled out, her car's headlights cutting through the dusk. A dark blue sedan eased out behind her, merging onto the same highway, its presence unremarkable at first. But as the miles ticked by, the sedan clung to her tail too close, matching her every move with unnerving precision. Clara adjusted her speed, testing the driver, speeding up, slowing down, but the sedan mirrored her. Relentless, the road was nearly empty, the high desert vast and silent, offering no reason for such pursuit. She wondered if it was a cop waiting for a mistake, but no lights flashed, no siren wailed. Her stomach twisted. This was no game. In the small town of Antonito, she pulled into a convenience store's lot, hoping the driver would reveal themselves. The sedan stopped behind her, but no one emerged, the tinted windows hiding any clue. Clara waited, heart pounding, before driving on, the sedan still glued to her bumper. The New Mexico state line loomed, and with it, certainty. This wasn't law enforcement. The dark mesa unfolded before her, a stretch of land whispered about in local lore, haunted, dangerous, a place where strange things happened. Clara's old iPhone, houseless without Wi-Fi, left her cut off. Alone with the sedan's headlights in her rearview mirror, fear crept in, sharp and cold. She missed the turn to her dirt road home, too rattled by the sedan's pursuit. A well-lit scenic rest area appeared, a beacon in the dark, and she pulled in to turn around. The sedan followed, parking close, its engine idling like a predator at rest. Clara's nerves snapped. She stepped out, bold or foolish, and approached the driver. Oh, to her shock, a middle-aged woman sat behind the wheel, her face plain, almost ordinary. Clara demanded answers, her voice sharp, and the woman apologized, claiming she mistook Clara's car for her daughter's. The excuse rang hollow. Clara's car bore unique bumper stickers and an out-of-state plate, unmistakable. Why follow for nearly 90 miles instead of calling her daughter? The woman apologized again, her voice flat. But when Clara drove off, the sedan trailed her onto the dead-end dirt road to her home. Clara's pulse raced. This was no mistake. The sedan pulled into her driveway, the woman stepping out, pleading to stay the night, citing exhaustion. Clara's fear turned to fury. She shouted for her to leave, her voice echoing in the night. Her boyfriend, Ethan, emerged from the house, drawn by the noise, and the woman froze, eyes wide, before scrambling back to her car and speeding away, tires screeching on the gravel. Clara stood trembling, Ethan's arm around her, the sedan's taillights vanishing into the dark. The encounter left a chill that lingered, a puzzle with no solution. What did the woman want? Why follow so far, so persistently? Back inside, Clara recounted every detail. her hands shaking as she described the sedan's relentless pursuit. Ethan listened, his face grim, suggesting it might have been a misunderstanding or something more sinister, human trafficking, a scam, or worse. The dark mesa was notorious. Travelers spoke of cars vanishing, of figures seen in the distance that didn't belong. Clara's car, with its bright stickers, was no stranger's vehicle. Yet the woman's story felt rehearsed. Her panic at Ethan's appearance too sudden. Clara checked her doors twice that night, her sleep uneasy. The sedan's headlights burned into her memory. She avoided that highway for weeks, taking longer routes, her eyes scanning for blue sedans. Friends in town had heard similar tales. Drivers followed through the mesa, some never reaching home. Clara dug into local history, finding stories of missing travelers in the 1970s, of strange lights on the road, of cars found abandoned with no trace of their drivers. One account mentioned a woman always alone, seen at rest stops. Her story changing with each telling. Was she a ghost, a drifter, or something else? Clara couldn't say. But the woman's face, ordinary yet wrong, haunted her. The incident reshaped Clara's view of the desert. Once a place of stark beauty, it now felt alive, watchful, its vastness hiding secrets. She shared the story sparingly, her voice low, the details too strange to dismiss. Ethan installed a dash cam. But Clara never felt safe on those roads again. The woman's plea, her sudden flight, the empty mesa, they were pieces of a mystery she'd never solve. She wondered if the sedan still roamed, searching for another car to follow, its driver waiting for the next lonely traveler to cross her path. Story number 18. The apartment was a crumbling box in a forgotten corner of Oregon, its walls thin as the promises of the man who raised Lucas. At 10, Lucas knew his father was a shadow, not a parent. His life a tangle of half-siblings he'd never met. But when a stranger knocked, claiming to be family, the air shifted, heavy with secrets the boy couldn't grasp. The man's smile was warm, but his eyes were cold, and the apartment, already small, felt like it was closing in. The stranger moved in, taking Lucas's room, his presence a puzzle that didn't fit. He was tall, wiry, with a laptop older than Lucas, and stories of a life on the run. Lucas wanted to believe he was a brother, a piece of the family he'd never known. But his father's unease was a warning. The apartment's walls seemed to watch, their cracks hiding truths no one spoke. Something was wrong, and the night would prove it. Screams tore through the dark, sharp and raw, waking Lucas from a restless sleep. His father's voice, laced with rage, echoed through the thin walls, followed by the thud of fists and feet. The stranger fled, a knife glinting in his hand, and Lucas's world tilted. The apartment wasn't safe anymore. It was a stage for betrayal, and the boy was caught in its spotlight, too young to understand, but old enough to fear. The man who called himself brother was gone, but his shadow lingered, a stain on the apartment's worn floors. Lucas's father guarded the door until dawn, his eyes haunted by more than the night's violence. The boy learned later that the stranger wasn't family, wasn't even who he claimed. The apartment had let in a predator, and Lucas wondered if it had wanted him to come. The truth came in pieces, whispered by a father who lied as easily as he breathed. The stranger had struck in the night, a blade aimed at a sleeping man, but the house had woken just in time. Lucas, now older, carried the memory like a scar, unsure what was real and what was his father's tale. The apartment was gone, but its secrets weren't, and Lucas knew some doors should never be opened. To begin this story, it's important to understand that my dad was never a good father. He lacked all the qualities a normal mentally healthy father would, and we lived in very low-income housing. The apartment was a patchwork of peeling paint and broken dreams, barely holding Lucas, his father, and his half-sister, Ellie, together. When he was in high school, he was told that he was unable to have kids due to a car accident. Unfortunately, he still could in fact have kids. And in his 20s to 30s, he actually managed to accumulate 13 kids. 15 now. I was number 13. Lucas knew only Ellie, the others ghosts and stories he'd never heard. Even though I lived week on week off custody with my father, it feels like I never really got to know him. Nor was I ever introduced to more than one of my father's other kids that were before me. My older half-sister was the only other person that I'd ever met. The stranger appeared one evening, knocking softly, his voice steady but worn. So, when I was 10, someone entered our apartment. I cannot remember what his name was, but he claimed to be one of my father's long-lost children. He called himself Caleb, said he'd come from California, needing a place to crash. He seemed to be in his late teens to early 20s, and he asked if he could stay with us for a while he attempted to get back on his feet after moving up from California. I'm in Oregon. He didn't seem to have many belongings except an old laptop and was rough around the edges. Mid-length hair, light shadow on the face, fairly skinny and tall. Caleb's clothes were frayed, his eyes sharp but guarded, like someone who'd seen too much. My dad was always weird about him, though. He told him that this was my brother, his family, and will be taking my room for a bit while I sleep in the living room. Lucas was relegated to a couch, the apartment's one window casting long shadows across his makeshift bed. What was weird, though, was that my dad would never let me enter my old room. Caleb was kind, or seemed to be. I remember thinking even though my new brother is kind of odd, he was a super cool guy, and I mean, we played Minecraft together on land. He was a programmer trying to make some Skyrim-like game, and he showed me everything that he had made so far. Lucas, wide-eyed, watched Caleb code, his laptop screen glowing with worlds that felt safer than their own. He stayed with us for around a month the day that he was chased out of the apartment. They bonded over a Minecraft Redstone challenge, a contest to build something grand. We were having a Minecraft Redstone competition to whoever could make the cooler redstone build. And the next day, we would present what we made and decide who had the better build. But the night broke that promise. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, who knows, that never came to happen because that night, I'm not sure what time it was, but at least past midnight, I heard screaming. It was clearly my father and loud banging coming from the wall over in our apartment. The walls shook, the air thick with rage and fear. After probably 30 seconds of banging on the couch, I witnessed my father, full rage, chasing out whoever my brother was as he ran out of the apartment holding a knife. Caleb fled, his silhouette a blur against the streetlights, his knife catching the light. My dad screamed and yelled, and he chased him outside. Lucas cowered, The couch no shield against the chaos. But as he ran away, my dad came back to make sure that we were okay. His father returned, panting, blood on his shirt, his eyes wild but soft when they met Lucas's. Much later that night, I went to sleep with my dad sitting in the living room until dawn, guarding the apartment. The apartment was silent, but not safe, its walls holding the echo of that night's violence. Lucas slept fitfully. The couch hard, the air heavy with questions he couldn't ask. Months passed before the truth trickled out. It wasn't until months later that I did find out exactly what had happened that night. Mostly my father's words. And he liked to embellish things. So definitely take this with a grain of salt. His father's story was dramatic, as always. Apparently, whoever was pretending to be my brother went into my father's room late at night and stabbed him in the chest while he was sleeping. The blade had struck shallow, a warning or a mistake. My father woke up, and since he had previous military work in the Middle East, I guess sprung pretty quickly into action as my younger sister was about to get stabbed too. Ellie, asleep in her room, had been spared by seconds. My father tackled the man and wrestled him for a bit, beating him senseless. After a struggle, he managed to get free and ran out of the apartment. The fight was brutal, furniture overturned, the apartment a battlefield. Lucas's mother, a nurse, filled in the gaps years later. Recently, I asked my mom about it, and she basically confirmed the whole story and added in some bits that put it all together. My mom saw the stab wound herself and said that he never went to the hospital, but instead that she patched him up, and she's a nurse, and he couldn't afford that anyway. It wasn't really that bad. She said the wound was real, but shallow, a secret kept from doctors and bills. But I guess at some point after it happened, I also told her about it, which I don't really have any memory of. Lucas's memory was a fog, the trauma buried deep. But the police at some point came by and took a look around. The impersonator was wanted in California, allegedly in Oregon, and Washington for a multitude of crimes. Caleb, or whoever he was a ghost, a drifter with a record. His name lost to Lucas, but not to the law. I don't remember his name, so it's not like I could ever find out if he was caught or anything. The apartment never felt the same. Lucas's father grew more distant, his eyes scanning the door as if Caleb might return. Ellie stopped talking about the night, her silliness louder than words. Lucas avoided the room that Caleb had taken, its door a reminder of trust betrayed. The Minecraft game stayed unfinished, the laptop gone with the stranger. Lucas wondered if Caleb had ever been a brother, or if the lie was all he'd left behind. Years later, Lucas lived far from that apartment, but the memory clung like damp rot. He asked questions, pieced together stories from his mother, from neighbors who'd heard the screams. The police had found nothing, no trace of Caleb, no proof he'd ever existed. Lucas searched online, hoping for a name, a face, but found only dead ends. The apartment was torn down, replaced by a parking lot. But its ghost lingered in Lucas's dreams, where a knife glinted and a stranger smiled. Now, at 21, Lucas carried the weight of that night, unsure what was true. His father's stories were a mix of bravado and fear. His mother's confirmation, a quiet truth. He avoided strangers, checked locks twice, and never played Minecraft again. The apartment had taught him a lesson, one he'd never forget. Some doors once open, lets in things that don't leave, and some brothers are nothing but shadows with knives and yasuit. Story number 9. In the heart of a rural nowhere, where the woods whispered secrets and the night held its breath. Ethan lived a quiet life caring for his grandfather until the darkness outside his home came alive. One late evening, alone in his basement, he heard footsteps on the gravel, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the drone of his movie. Then came the taps. 3 distinct knocks on his window, chilling in their precision, as if someone knew exactly where he sat. Armed with his rifle and years of training, Ethan stepped into the night, only to find the silence of the woods mocking him, broken by a voice that answered his call. What followed was a night of unseen threats, footsteps on the roof, and a mystery that left Ethan questioning his sanity, his safety, and the very nature of the world around him. Ethan's home was a fortress of solitude, nestled in a rural stretch where neighbors were scarce and crime was a distant rumor. He lived with his elderly grandfather, his primary caretaker, in a small town surrounded by wooded areas and farmland. The house was encircled by trees, a dense tree line separating them from the nearest neighbors. Ethan, a former firearm instructor with extensive firearm training, was no stranger to vigilance. He was sitting in his basement on the couch, about to go to sleep, a routine that felt as natural as breathing. The couch sat in front of a big window with closed blinds and a glass door covered with a semi-transparent shade. You could barely make out a silhouette through it if needed. The night began like any other, with Ethan lost in a movie, headphones on, the world outside forgotten. But something broke through, a sound, faint but insistent, like footsteps in the gravel driveway just outside the door, not walking, more like dancing or sprinting. He took off the headphones to listen closely. The movie's noise fading. The sound was unmistakable, erratic, purposeful. He got up and looked out the glass door, seeing nothing. He dismissed it as an animal, maybe a deer, and settled back down. But before he could resume, 3 distinct taps hit the window opposite the couch. He was startled. Nobody he knew would do that. They'd call or knock on the door. As he stood, the gravel rustled again, louder, like someone running away toward the briar patch and wooded area. Ethan's training kicked in. He grabbed his rifle from the closet beside the basement door and stepped outside, using the flashlight attached to the rifle. He scanned the tree line for threats, convinced robbers were prowling. Nothing stirred, no shadows, no movement. He returned inside, trying to convince himself it was wildlife. He turned off all the lights and stood behind the glass door with the shade, outside floodlights on, invisible to the outside world. It was extremely quiet, like in scary movies when even the bugs and birds are silent. The absence of sound was suffocating, the woods holding their breath. Just as he was about to give up, a flicker of light appeared in the woods, the size of a dime, like a reflection of house lights on metal, followed by rustling bushes. Ethan's pulse quickened. He stepped outside and yelled, "Hey!" to scare off whatever it was. A response came, a loud whisper, audible from 100 feet away, saying, "Hey!" back. It wasn't an echo. It was human, deliberate. He shouldered his rifle, pointed the flashlight into the woods, and yelled, "Wrong house. Dude, get off my property or you won't make it out." Then to his right, a soft whistle, like a bird, 2 notes from the tree line. He turned, aimed the rifle 20 feet short of the sound, and fired shots into the ground, hoping to scare them off. The neighbor's dog barked, likely at the gunshots. He kept the flashlight on the tree line, scanning for movement, but saw nothing. No one fled, no footsteps echoed. He checked the less dense area where the whistle came from, finding no sign of people. The night wasn't done with him. As he walked back to the house, his grandfather, 4, met him at the door, asking what happened. Ethan explained, loaded his grandfather's revolver, and set it by his bedside in case of a break-in. They slept on opposite ends of the house, on separate floors, so this felt safest. After settling his grandfather, Ethan went to the upstairs kitchen for a bottle of water. As he closed the refrigerator door, he heard footsteps on the roof of their 2-story home. The lowest point of the roof required a ladder. An Olympic high jumper couldn't reach it. His body was covered in chills, the hair on his neck standing up. The footsteps were heavy, grown man-sized, walking slowly from his grandfather's room to the kitchen area. Ethan froze, staring at the kitchen skylight, praying nothing would look back. The footsteps continued back and forth across the house. He ran downstairs, grabbed his rifle, and rushed outside, heart pounding. He scanned the roof with the weapon's flashlight, circling the house, checking trees and roof lines. Nothing. He repeated this twice, yelling, "I don't know what you are, but you better get out of here." No response, no movement. Defeated, he returned inside, sat with his rifle, and watched TV all night. The sound stopped, but sleep eluded him. No weird occurrences happened since, but the last few nights had been rough, with little sleep. Ethan shared the story with family and friends, who dismissed it as imagination or a prank. They suggested the footsteps were imagined, the whistle a bird, or kids playing tricks. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He'd never had hallucinations, and the events felt too real, too coordinated. The loud whispering, the distinct footsteps on the roof. He didn't think birds could speak or weigh 200 pounds. He wondered if he was crazy or if it was a well-executed prank. But no one claimed responsibility. No cameras appeared. As a skeptic of the paranormal, Ethan struggled to reconcile his beliefs with the night's events. The encounter freaked him out, leaving him questioning, a shadow over his quiet life that refused to lift. Story number 20. The forest swallowed the light, turning the dusk into a suffocating void. Caleb, an 11-year-old boy, stood alone in the swampy North Carolina woods, clutching a trash bag. His cousins had lured him into a snipe hunt, a cruel prank to abandon him. The air was thick, heavy with moss and the buzz of unseen insects. He was no stranger to these woods, a Boy Scout who'd hunted with his grandfather. But tonight, the trees seemed to lean closer, their shadows alive. Something was out there, and it wasn't a snipe. The woods were a maze of pines and willows, dark even in daylight. Caleb's small town, with its single gas station and caution light, thrived on superstition. Stories of cryptids, wendigos, wampus cats haunted the Carolina hills. His cousins, older and bolder, had laughed as they led him deeper, promising a flightless bird to catch. He held the bag to the ground, waiting for them to drive the snipe toward him, but their voices faded, leaving only silence and the weight of betrayal. The darkness grew thicker, the woods eerily quiet. Caleb's flashlight flickered, barely piercing the black. He'd heard a deer's distress call, like a sneeze with a whistle, and chuckled. It was a familiar sound, one he'd heard hunting with his grandfather. But the absence of sound, crickets, owls, cicadas, unsettled him. The forest was never silent, not unless something was wrong. He sat against a pine tree, realizing the prank, the bag limp in his hands. The night pressed in, heavy and watchful. Then a whistle cut through the silence, sharp and rhythmic, like a cowboy's call. It came from behind, maybe 30 feet away. Caleb froze, his heart pounding. His instincts screamed not to move, not to turn around. It wasn't his cousins. They'd have shouted, stumbled through the leaves. This was something else, something that didn't belong. The whistle came again, closer, screechier, like a parrot mimicking a human. No footsteps, no rustle, just a putrid smell like roadkill and smoke, flooding the air. The silence returned, heavier, suffocating. Caleb's breath was shallow, his body locked in place. Another whistle, now 10 feet away, congested and wrong. His neck prickled, every fiber urging him to stay still. A deep breath sounded inches behind him, the stench choking his lungs. He turned against every instinct and saw antlers curling around the pine, inches from his shoulders. A final whistle, soft and warm, beckoned him to stay. Then the woods erupted, crickets screaming, owls shrieking, cicadas wailing. Caleb dropped the bag and ran, his legs pumping through the dark. He glanced back, seeing nothing but chaos in the trees. The forest was alive, urging him to flee. He stumbled over roots, his flashlight lost, guided only by panic. No footsteps followed, no antlers moved, but the presence was there, a shadow just out of sight. He broke through to the pasture, crawling under the electric fence, gasping for air. A single whistle echoed from the tree, close, too close. He sprinted home, never looking back. The house was quiet. His cousins, sprawled on the couch, passed out from gaming. Caleb collapsed, his chest heaving, trying to erase the night. He saw something black outside, thinking it was the bag he'd left. His cousin Daniel laughed, handing him a rifle to check. It was the trash bag, impossibly returned from the woods. Caleb's blood ran cold. The bag was pristine, untouched by mud or thorns, as if placed there by unseen hands. He never spoke of it, but the woods were no longer his playground. Years later, Caleb learned the land's secrets. An old farmer spoke of a creature, not a wendigo or wampus, but something older, tied to the hills. It mimicked soons, lured the unwary, and thrived in fear. The woods stayed dark, even in daylight, hiding what lurked within. Caleb avoided them, but the whistle haunted his dreams, soft and inviting. He knew something was out there, something no one could stop. The bag, the antlers, the silence, they were warnings, and he'd never forget. Story number 21. On a deserted New York beach where the waves whispered secrets to the sand, Clara and her sister sought solace in the sun, unaware of the shadow approaching. The beach, empty save for a lone wanderer, felt safe at first, its isolation a quiet retreat. But a man's sudden approach, his arms swinging, his eyes locked on them, turned their peaceful day into a pulse of fear. His silence was louder than words, his gaze a weight that pinned them in place. As they fled, his stare followed, a haunting promise of intent they couldn't name. The ocean stretched endless, but its vastness offered no comfort. only a reminder of how alone they were with a stranger who saw too much. The sand seemed to shift, the air growing heavy with unspoken threat. Clara and her sister, hearts pounding, gathered their things, the beach no longer a haven. Each step away felt like a gamble. The man's eyes burning into their backs, a specter of what might have been. The dunes hid the horizon, but not the fear that clung to them. This was no ordinary day at the beach. It was a moment that would linger in their nightmares, a shadow cast by a man who never spoke. My sister and I went to the beach since it's still warm out in New York and we wanted to get some sun. Clara and her sister, Lila, craved the rare warmth of a late-season day, the ocean's call pulling them to a familiar shore. Since it's after Labor Day and schools are back in session, there are no lifeguards there, and really it's pretty isolated. The beach was nearly empty, its solitude both calming and eerie. We arrived, and there was a couple sitting near us, as well as a man who was walking in the sand with his headphones in. A couple lounged nearby, their chatter a soft hum, while a man paced the shoreline, lost in his music. The scene felt safe, the waves a steady rhythm against the quiet. The sisters settled in, their chairs and blankets staking claim to a patch of sand. My sister was sitting in her beach chair, and I decided to lay on my stomach to get the back of my body more tanned. Clara stretched out, soaking in the sun, while Lila read. The day unfolding with lazy ease. The couple who was sitting near us left the beach. The couple packed up, leaving the sisters with the distant man and two women far off in beach chairs. The man who was walking in the sand was still there, and further in the distance were two women sitting on their beach chairs. The beach felt emptier, its vastness swallowing the last traces of company. The peace shattered with Lila's trembling voice when all of a sudden I hear my sister say in a very fearful voice to me, "There's a man coming toward us." Clara bolted upright, her heart catching as the man with headphones approached, his arm swinging deliberately. But the man who was walking the beach with his headphones in came walking toward us, swinging his arms back and forth. He stopped at the edge of their blanket, his presence a sudden intrusion. I immediately got up, and he was now on the edge of my beach blanket, his eyes, cold and unyielding, locked onto them, saying nothing. Both my sister and I panicked in the moment and basically froze. Clara tried to break the tension, her voice shaky. I asked him if he needed something, but he didn't say anything. He just stared at my sister and me. Lila's whisper was urgent, her fear contagious. My sister said, "Let's get our belongings and let's just go." They scrambled, grabbing their things, the sand clinging to their haste. We got off our beach blanket and we exited the beach. The man didn't move, his gaze a weight that followed them. But the whole encounter really had my sister and I shaken up. The beach, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, its isolation a threat they hadn't anticipated. I don't know what he was going to do to us or if he would have been waiting for us in the parking lot or what, but the look in his eyes is something I'll never forget. They reached their car, hearts still racing, and drove away, the ocean fading in the rear view. We immediately contacted the police after this, and we filed a report. The police took their statement, but the man's intentions remained a mystery. His silent stare, a lingering specter. Clara and Lila replayed the moment, questioning what he wanted, why he approached. The beach, a place of memories, was now tainted, its sands holding a fear they couldn't shake. They avoided it after that, choosing crowded parks over the shore's solitude, the man's eyes a warning etched in their minds. Story number 22. The woods stretched dark and endless, their shadows swallowing the road that cut through them, a lonely path between two small towns. For Jake, a 19-year-old college kid, staying home sick while his girlfriend drove through that forest was routine, until her call came and something else answered. The night was quiet. His mother's house warm, but a chill settled in his bones as the phone rang. A voice, not hers, spoke through the line, and it wasn't human. The fall air was crisp, the kind that made the woods feel alive, their branches clawing at the sky. Jake's girlfriend, Sarah, had gone to a co-worker's party, leaving him curled up in bed, fighting a fever. She'd called to chat, her voice a comfort as she navigated the wooded road, but the call cut off, leaving only silence. She called back almost immediately. I answered the phone, but it wasn't her. Jake's heart skipped, expecting a dropped signal, but what came next was no glitch. The voice was deep, clear, urgent, and angry, speaking a language he didn't know. It was a deep voice, but it was completely clear. What I mean by clear is that it wasn't like staticky or anything. It wasn't any tongue he recognized, not German, French, or Spanish. It was speaking in a language I've never heard before. It wasn't German, French, Romanian, Spanish, or whatever. The sound was wrong, too raw, too otherworldly, like it came from somewhere beyond. It might be dramatic to say this too, but the voice didn't sound well human. Jake froze in his bedroom, the phone pressed to his ear, his breath shallow. I wish that I could somehow record my thoughts so that I could post the memory of this voice for all of you to hear, because it was just indescribable. The voice kept speaking, its tone sharp, commanding, as if it knew him. He stumbled to the living room, panic rising, needing his mother to hear it. I eventually got up in a panic and ran to my mom in the living room. I handed her the phone and frantically said, "Please listen to this." The call cut off as his mother took the phone, but as soon as she put it to her ear, the phone hung up. Seconds later, it rang again, Sarah's voice, shaken, asking what that was. Just like before, my girlfriend called back almost immediately. I hesitated to pick it up this time, but when I did, it was actually her, and the first thing out of her mouth was, "What the heck was that?" She'd heard it too, the same voice, thinking Jake had called her back. According to her, I'm the one that called her back. And when she picked up, she heard the same voice that I did. The woods had spoken, and they'd both heard it, a presence that wasn't supposed to be there. Jake and Sarah pieced it together, their voices trembling over the phone. We're still on good terms to this day. We broke up maybe a year after this incident. But whenever we see each other, we're both like, "Remember that phone call that we had?" Friends dismissed it as radio interference. But Jake knew better. The clarity, the anger, the language no one could place. Whenever I bring it up, people say it's radio interference or I picked up another call somehow. I'm willing to accept a non-paranormal explanation if it's a good one, but it was definitely not radio interference. The road through the woods, a place they'd driven countless times, had turned strange that night, as if something ancient had reached out through the wires. Years later, the memory lingered, sharp and unsettling. So, Do you have any other suggestions or thoughts? Jake and Sarah still talked about it. The call a shared scar that defied explanation. Was it a spirit tied to the forest? Something stirred by the dark? Or a glitch in reality? A voice from nowhere that found them both? The woods kept their secret, but Jake never forgot the sound, the way it seemed to know him, waiting in the silence for a moment to speak again. Story number 23, The House Was Quiet. A familiar haven for a teenager seeking solitude. But something stirred in its shadows. A figure moved through the hallway, too familiar to spark fear, yet too wrong to belong. It wore the face of a loved one, but its silence screamed of something else. The air grew heavy, as if the walls themselves knew a secret they couldn't share. For men, this wasn't just a day at home. It was a glimpse into a world where trust could betray. Min's grandmother, of Vietnamese descent, told tales of sensing unearthly beings since her childhood. She recounted walking home from school along an abandoned railroad in Vietnam, following a distant lantern that lured her and friends astray, never getting closer, leading them far off course until dark. Her parents taught her to break the spell by wiping urine on her face, a strange remedy that snapped them out of it. The story felt like folklore, but her eyes held a truth that chilled men. In her later years in the States, she claimed a dark portal existed in the room next to Min's bedroom, mentioned casually at a family dinner, where their Buddhist family openly discussed such things. At 14, Min skipped summer camp, walked 2 miles home, showered, and watched Weeds on Netflix. He saw his mother walk past his room toward the air conditioning panel, not acknowledging him or his unexpected presence. She moved to the living room without a word. Hours later, his mother returned from work via the garage, questioning why he was home. He told her he saw her earlier, but she insisted she hadn't been home. The figure was unmistakably her. So convincing, Min felt no fear initially, assuming she was just home. But the realization hit hard. She wasn't there, yet something wore her face. Min shared the story with his grandmother, who revealed seeing his deceased great-grandmother in that hallway. Min, skeptical of the paranormal, doubted her tales, especially the lantern story. But this experience gave him goosebumps, shaking his beliefs. The figure's silence, its perfect mimicry, felt like a violation of his home's safety. He asked his father, a pragmatic man who dismissed it as imagination. But Min saw the doubt in his eyes. The hallway now felt alive, as if it watched him, waiting for him to notice again. Min's cousin, visiting one weekend, mentioned hearing footsteps in that same hallway at night, stopping just outside Min's door. "It sounded like your mom," she whispered. "But I knew she was asleep." Min checked the room next to his, finding only old furniture, but the air felt heavy, like a presence lingered. He stood there, heart pounding, expecting to see her again, but saw only shadows. A neighbor, an elderly woman with deep ties to the community, shared tales of the house's past, a family tragedy in the 1940s, a mother lost to illness, her presence reportedly seen by later tenants. "She borrows faces," the neighbor said, "to feel alive again." Min stopped lingering in the hallway, keeping his door closed at night. Every creak felt like her footsteps, every shadow a mimic waiting to appear. He researched the house's history, finding records of unexplained sightings, figures resembling loved ones, always in that hallway, always silent. A 9th century diary from the library described a false mother seen by a child, vanishing when approached. Min's grandmother, now frail, warned him to avoid the room next to his, saying the portal fed on familiarity, taking the shapes of those you trusted. "It wants to be seen," she said, her voice trembling. Min moved out years later, but the memory clung to him in new homes. He checks its hallways at night, half expecting his mother's face, knowing it's not her. The house still stands, its portal room untouched, and Min wonders if the mimic still walks, wearing faces to lure the unwary. Story number 24. The old house groaned under the weight of its years, its walls hiding secrets too heavy to name. A young boy stepped into his new room, his eyes scanning the crack of the door for signs of life. Nothing stirred, but the air felt wrong, thick with a presence that watched. Then, by the window, a figure stood, an old woman, her back to him, her form still as stone. She wasn't supposed to be there, yet she was tied to the room like a memory that refused to fade. The boy's heart stopped. The house no longer a home, but a tomb. The woman's silhouette was a shadow from another time. Her dark-curled hair and frail posture marked her age, yet she stood where no one should. Near the window by his bed, the room, once a refuge, now pulsed with her presence. Silent but undeniable, he fled, his breath ragged. The image of her burned into his mind. What was she, and why did she linger in his space? The house, run down and weary, seemed to hold her close, its creaks whispering her story. The days that followed were heavy with unease. The boy's mother, skeptical at first, learned truths that chilled them both. The room had been hers, a woman who'd lived and died within these walls. Her life, her end, was woven into the house, her shadow lingering where she'd stood. Could a place hold a soul, or was she something more, watching from beyond? The boy avoided the room, but its pull was strong, its secrets clawing at his peace. The truth came in fragments, each one darker than the last. Clothes in the wardrobe, not his own, spoke of her life. A stain beneath the carpet marked her death. The house wasn't empty, it was alive, its history breathing through every crack. The boy's fear grew not of the woman, but of what the house had become, a keeper of her memory, her pain. How do you live in a place that remembers the dead? The window, her window, was a portal to a past he couldn't escape. She was gone, but never truly left. The boy moved on, but the house stayed with him, its shadows etched into his soul. The woman by the window was more than a ghost. She was a warning, a piece of the house's heart. He'd left its walls, but her gaze followed, a reminder that some places hold their dead too close. The room was hers, and she'd claimed it, forever watching from the edges of his life. At 11, James moved with his mom to her new boyfriend's house, a rundown, outdated place before she redecorated. He got a nicely sized room compared to his old one, though it was outdated, and felt uneasy after a few nights. Blaming the drastic change, he'd heard noises, thumps, footsteps on the stairs. One day, he caught glimpses through the crack of his door, but saw nothing. He checked the crack before entering, and finding it clear, stepped inside. He froze when he saw a woman with dark permed hair facing away, old by her arms and posture, standing near the window by the right side of his bed, terrified, glad he slept on the left. He ran down in a panic, telling his mom about the elderly lady, his mother, skeptical but uneasy. Didn't quite believe him at first. They avoided dwelling on it to keep calm. Days later, after school, his mom, in the kitchen, said she'd spoken to the neighbor who revealed a lady had lived there before, in James's room, and died there, found days later. That was unsettling. But James stayed composed, knowing many houses have such histories. Then his mother asked about the woman's hair color, and James said, funnily enough, dark, not gray. His mom's face dropped, explaining the neighbor said the lady dyed her hair dark into her later years. James thought she was joking, as his mom often tried to scare him for fun, but she insisted. His skepticism faded when she redecorated, finding old ladies' clothes and men's shoes in the wardrobe and a decomposition stain under the carpet by the window. He hated that room forever after. The house's history seeped into James's life. The woman's presence wasn't just a sighting, it was a claim. Her shadow tied to the room's very walls. The noises, the glimpses, the figure, they weren't random, but part of a place that remembered its dead. The wardrobe's contents and the stain were proof, physical remnants of a life ended where he slept. He avoided the room, sleeping elsewhere when he could. But the house's weight followed, its creaks and shadows a constant reminder of her lingering gaze. Years later, James, now grown, carried the memory like a scar. The room had changed him, its secrets too heavy to shake. The woman by the window wasn't just a ghost. She was the house's memory, her life and death woven into its foundation. He'd left, but the unease stayed, a lesson that some places hold their past too tightly. The stain, the clothes, her dark hair, they were pieces of a puzzle he'd never solve. A reminder that some rooms belong to the dead, and their shadows never truly leave. Story number 25. The old house loomed like a sentinel, its weathered walls steeped in secrets that whispered through the night. Clara, a young teenager, stood in its shadow. Her family's new home, a legacy of generations past. It's a beautiful place with a lot of character. But from the moment that we moved in, something always felt off. The air was heavy, charged with an unseen presence that pricked at her skin. The first sign was the constant feeling of just being watched. Every step echoed too loudly, every shadow lingered too long. We would frequently hear footsteps when nobody was around, and doors would open and close on their own. 2, the house was never silent, never still. My parents brushed it off as the house settling or old plumbing and all that, but I certainly wasn't convinced. Clara felt it, a gaze not human, following her through the halls, and one night I was home alone while my parents were out. The living room's dim light flickered, the TV's hum a fragile shield against the dark. I was in the living room watching some TV when I heard someone calling my name from upstairs. The voice was soft, familiar, but wrong, like her mother's but colder. Honestly, it sounded like my mom. But when I went up to check, the house was obviously empty. Clara's heart raced as she climbed the stairs. I called out, but got no response. I checked every room, but nobody was there. The rooms were dark, the air thick, as if the house held its breath. A few nights later, while I was trying to sleep, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. It was light but deliberate, a touch that burned with ice. I turned around to find nothing but the dark, empty room. Her breath caught, the darkness alive. Watching her, my heart was racing, though, and I barely slept that night. Sleep became a battle, the house a maze of unseen eyes. The nights grew heavier, the house more brazen. The final straw came one evening, though, when we were having a family dinner. The dining room was warm, filled with laughter, until a sharp crash broke the moment. A picture frame fell off the wall and shattered on the floor. Glass scattered across the floor, glinting like teeth. And when we picked it up, the picture was of a woman that we didn't recognize. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp, staring from the faded photograph. We had never seen her before, and she wasn't a relative. Clara's parents froze, their faces pale, the woman's gaze a violation of their home. The truth came later, chilling and undeniable. My parents did some research and found out that the woman had lived in the house decades before and had died under mysterious circumstances. The records spoke of a woman who vanished, her death unexplained, her presence tied to the house. Since then, we've had the house blessed and tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but the feeling of unease just never fully went away. The blessing was a desperate act, but the house held tight, its walls unyielding. Clara moved to a new home, but the woman's face lingered, etched in her mind. At night, she'd hear faint footsteps, not in her new apartment, but in her dreams, echoing from that old house. The fear followed, subtle but relentless. Clara began to notice small things. Doors left ajar, shadows flickering where none should be. She researched the house further, finding whispers of a tragedy, a woman wronged. Her life ended in the house's shadows. An old diary found in the town archive spoke of a tenant who heard her name called at night, who found frames broken, faces unfamiliar. Clara's stomach churned. Had the woman been trying to speak, to claim? Her dreams grew vivid, the woman's face staring from mirrors, her hand cold on Clara's shoulder. The signs grew bolder. At night, Clara would hear faint taps on her walls, like fingers testing the boundaries of her new home. She kept lights on, avoided mirrors, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. One night, she found a crack in a family photo. The glass splintered over her own face as if marked. She contacted a medium, a woman named Elena, who knew the town's secrets. Elena's face darkened as she listened. Some spirits don't rest. They reach, they claim, she said. That house was hers, and you carried her with you. Elena offered a ritual, salt, sage, a chant to sever the tie, but it meant returning to the house. Clara hesitated. The memory of that cold hand too raw, but the taps grew louder, the air colder, her dreams darker. She tried the ritual alone, scattering sage in her apartment, but the shadows seemed to laugh. One night she woke to a weight on her shoulder, not touching, but there, watching, waiting. She didn't move, didn't speak, until dawn broke the spell. The woman was hers now, a frame she couldn't shatter. Story number 26. The hospital sprawled across the city, its 4 buildings a maze of life and death, where every hallway held a story. For Ryan, a new security guard, it was a dream job, each shift brimming with excitement and camaraderie. But beneath the bustle, the old clinic, known as the Asbestos Clinic for its troubled past, stood apart, its walls whispering of a time when it housed the dying. Ryan, intrigued by tales of the paranormal, walked its halls with a mix of skepticism and curiosity, unaware that one night would test his nerve. The Asbestos Clinic was a relic, its 8 stories creaking with sage, once a tuberculosis sanatorium in the 1950s and 60s. Guards spoke of a young girl who'd taken her life on the 2nd floor, of tunnels below used to move bodies in secret. Ryan had patrolled it countless times, the elevators opening on their own, a quirk he dismissed as mechanical. But the basement, with its labyrinth of sealed tunnels, felt different, darker, heavier, as if the air itself held memories of the dead. On a quiet night shift, Ryan set out to patrol the clinic, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The building was locked tight, its doors secured by dusk. But as he circled the exterior, a door stood ajar, its frame catching the faint glow of his beam. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from duty. The clinic had no cameras, so an open door meant a thorough sweep, a task he'd done before when homeless intruders sought shelter. He stepped inside, the silence swallowing his footsteps. The first floor was empty, every room locked, every hallway still. But as he approached the elevator, a faint sound broke the quiet, a creak like a door easing open. Ryan's hand went to his radio, his voice steady as he reported the anomaly to his team lead. She sent Fred Puh, a guard from the nearby cancer clinic, to assist. Together, they scoured the upper floors, finding nothing but shadows. Ryan's curiosity grew, the stories of the haunted clinic tugging at his band, urging him to dig deeper. Alone again, Ryan descended to the basement, determined to face whatever lingered there. The elevator doors opened to a chill, the air thick with the weight of forgotten years. He unlocked a tunnel door, its hinges groaning, and ventured into the dark, his flashlight flickering as if reluctant to pierce the gloom. At the tunnel's end, he stopped, listening, and then it comped a blood-curdling scream, a woman's voice echoing from the entrance, sharp enough to jolt his heart into overdrive. So, about 9 months ago, I began working as a hospital security guard at a major hospital in my city. Ryan had found his calling, the job a perfect blend of action and connection. It's been the most exciting and enjoyable job that I've ever had. I'm incredibly grateful for it, as I've made many new friends and accumulated countless stories to share. The hospital was a world of its own, alive with chaos and care. Before I started this job, I was already intrigued by the idea of paranormal activity in a major hospital. I mean, people pass away in hospitals every day. So you'd think that it would be a hotspot for ghostly encounters, right? Ryan had hoped for something spectral, but nothing dramatic had materialized. Still, I wouldn't be sharing this if I hadn't experienced anything at all. The Asbestos Clinic was his focus, its history heavy with death. This is where the story I'm about to share takes place. So when I first started the job and was shown around the various buildings, the old clinic, which we'll call the Asbestos Clinic, due to its history of asbestos issues, immediately stood out to me. Its decay was palpable, a building past its time. And during my initial walkthrough, a fellow guard told me that this building was haunted by a young girl who took her own life on the 2nd floor. He also mentioned that the basement was haunted, The tales fueled Ryan's curiosity. The whole building used to be a tuberculosis sanatorium back in the 50s and 60s, with tunnels in the basement that were once used to transport bodies. I had done countless patrols of the asbestos clinic before, but nothing much had happened aside from the elevators occasionally opening on their own, which was apparently normal. But that night, the open door changed everything. However, I noticed that one of the exterior doors was slightly open. Ryan's instincts kicked in, his training overriding any supernatural thoughts. The building doesn't have any interior cameras, so when something like this happens at night, I have to check every unlocked room inside to make sure that nobody is inside. I entered the building and started my patrol of the first floor, checking every door and hallway. The creak came again, sharp and deliberate. As I approached the elevator to go up to the second floor, though, I heard a faint creaking sound, like a door opening. Ryan radioed for backup, his voice calm but alert. At that, I immediately radioed my team lead, informing her that I had found an open door and was hearing noises. I told her that I was going to conduct a thorough patrol, and she sent one of the guards from the cancer clinic, Fred, to assist me. Fred's search of the upper floors yielded nothing, and Ryan's sweep of the second floor was equally empty. After searching the first floor again and finding nothing, Fred arrived. He told me that he would start searching the third and fourth floors while I covered the second floor and basement. The creak returned, chilling Ryan's blood. As I was searching the second floor, I heard the same creaking noise again, the sound of a door opening. They found no intruders, no explanation. We searched every room on the second floor, but in the end, we found nothing. Ryan's curiosity won out, pushing him to explore further, and that got me thinking, this might be the perfect time to continue my ghost hunting. So, I went back into the building, determined to capture some activity. He sat on the second floor, waiting, but boredom drove him deeper. After about 10 minutes of nothing, I got bored, and I decided to head down to the basement. The tunnels called to him, their darkness a challenge. Now, the basement is an eerie place, let me tell you, filled with tunnels that mostly lead to nowhere. Once I exited the elevator, I made my way to one of the locked doors leading to the longest tunnel. The tunnel stretched into shadow, his radio useless. I unlocked the door and ventured down the tunnel, taking note of my radio beeping to indicate that it had lost signal. A common issue in the basement areas here. His flashlight flickered, the air growing colder. As I reached the end of the tunnel, my flashlight started to flicker. Then came the scream, raw and female, from the tunnel's mouth. I decided to stand still and listen for a bit, and to my shock, I heard a blood-curdling female scream coming from the start of the tunnel. Ryan ran, his flashlight barely holding. At that, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I turned around, pointing my flickering flashlight back toward the entrance, and started running toward the scream. He found an open door, one only security could unlock, but it was empty. I looked around the basement and noticed that one of the doors was open. This door was supposed to be locked, which only security have access to the keys for. I looked inside of the room, but nobody was there. His radio was dead, his heart racing. When I reached the entrance, I tried to radio my team lead, but my radio was still out of signal. Back upstairs, Ryan reported the incident, and Fred returned to help. I was still unsure if I had experienced something paranormal or if somebody had actually broken in, But once I got back to the main floor, I radioed my team lead to let her know what had happened. She sent Fred back to help me investigate the source of the scream in the basement. A stench hit them, rotting, unmistakable, like the morgue. When we arrived, we went back to the basement. I showed him the room that had been opened, and we both noticed a very distinct and strong smell, something like that of a decomposing body. They found nothing, no source, just the lingering odor. Having spent time in the hospital morgue, I was all too familiar with that smell, and we searched the room, but we couldn't find anything. Ryan left the basement, shaken. His patrols there forever changed ever since that experience, though I've sort of rushed through my patrols in that basement, as that smell still lingers. Every time I pass that room, the scream, the smell, the open door, they defied explanation. A brush with something beyond the living. Ryan still loved his job, but the asbestos clinic was no longer just a building. It was a place where the past refused to rest, where a scream echoed in his mind, a reminder of the thin veil between life and what came after. Story number 27. The house was new, its walls promising a fresh start. But for Lila, it was a cage that hid its claws. At 16, she'd claimed her room with joy, decorating it with dreams of belonging, but the air held a secret, a whisper of something watching. The first week was a facade, shattered when a scream, sharp, feminine, inhuman, tore through the kitchen, sending her cat fleeing. Lila's heart pounded, the sound echoing in her bones, a warning that the house wasn't hers, and something else claimed it as home. The kitchen door to the garage loomed like a portal, its silence mocking her fear. Lila's brother heard nothing. Her mother dismissed it. But the cat's panic was proof enough. The house felt different now, its warmth replaced by a chill that clung to the walls. Lila's room, once a sanctuary, was no longer safe. Objects moved, doors shifted, and the air grew heavy with a presence that knew her name, waiting for her to acknowledge it. Night brought no peace. Lila woke to a figure on her bed, a featureless shadow of a man, its gaze a weight that pinned her in place. It charged, a blur of malice, and her scream woke the house. But it was gone when the light flicked on. Her mother called it a dream, but Lila knew better. The house was alive, its rooms a stage for something that wanted her fear, something that wouldn't let her rest. The disturbances grew bolder. A pillow stood impossibly upright, a closet door hung broken, and a Ouija board she crafted in desperation spun on its own, a bottle cap dancing like a possessed coin. Lila's attempts to communicate only angered it, and the house responded with a violence that left her breathless. The night the blanket rose, towering over her, it pinned her down, stealing her air as if the house itself wanted to claim her life. Morning offered no answers, only a voice, clear and chilling, speaking beside her, an apology for her mother's disbelief. Lila fled to school, the house's grip too much to bear. The family left soon after, but the presence lingered in Lila's mind, a shadow that targeted her alone, leaving her to wonder what it wanted and why it chose her. The house was empty now, but its secrets were not. The move to the new house was a fresh chapter for Lila's family. My first experience with the paranormal was actually a string of experiences. Honestly, I really loved that house. 2. I had my own room that I picked myself, and I didn't feel any kind of hesitance while unpacking and decorating to make myself feel more at home. But the joy faded fast. After school, I would get home with my little brother about an hour before my mom. One day, Lila found her cat staring at the garage door. I threw my bag onto the kitchen table and found my cat stood frozen, staring at a door in the kitchen that led to our garage. A scream erupted, sending the cat bolting. I spoke to my cat. "Hey, what are you doing?" I walked us towards him, but before I could touch him, a woman's scream came from the garage, and my cat literally sprinted from the room. Lila fled with her brother, but he heard nothing. My brother insisted that he didn't hear anything, though, and my mom suggested that I must have imagined it. The house was empty when checked. Once my mom got home, we checked the house to find nothing. In her room, Lila found chaos, a broken closet door, a standing pillow. I stood in the doorway, freezing in my tracks. My closet door was slid open and hanging from its track, as if someone had tried to pull it off. And my pillow was standing in the middle of the room. Her mother dismissed it. "You must have knocked it off the bed when you woke up this morning." She brushed it off. But I knew that I hadn't. Lila couldn't replicate it. I played with the pillow for like several minutes, trying to mimic the position that it had been in. But I just couldn't get it to happen again. Night brought terror. When I returned to my doorway and to my bedroom, I froze. The light from the bathroom shined just barely into my room, making it impossible to miss because I could see a figure sitting on the edge of my bed. It had no features, just the shadow of a large man. It charged her, and she fell, screaming. But before I could move any further, the figure stood and instantly charged at me. I have never screamed so loud. Nothing was there when the light came on. And when I looked again, nothing was there. Her mother insisted it was a dream. "You were dreaming," my mom told me. I was awake. I was up. I tried to argue, but she just shook her head. The house felt alien now. That house suddenly didn't feel like home to me, and my room did not feel like mine anymore. Lila tried a Ouija board, desperate. I then attempted to make a Ouija board out of cardboard and a clear bottle cap because I was desperate to confirm my own experiences. It didn't move. "Hello," I said quietly, waiting for a response. "Nothing. I'm sorry if we've moved into your home. I'll be a good roommate. I'm very clean." I began to ramble, but the bottle cap, it never moved. Then the cap spun wildly. I flipped on my bedside lamp and noticed that the board on the floor, only the bottle cap, was standing on its side, spinning like a quarter in fast circles. Lila destroyed it. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the board, tearing it in half and shoving it in the trash. Later, her blanket rose, suffocating her. I lifted my blindfold, and I was horrified to see my blanket standing tall above me. It had to have been about 6 feet, towering over my body. I moved quickly, attempting to throw my feet to the side and run to the door, but the blanket fell and I was forced back to my mattress. A weight suddenly suffocating me, as if somebody had just laid on top of me. Morning brought a voice, chilling and clear. I'm sorry about your mom," a man's voice said clearly beside me. I gasped and sat straight up, but no one was there. Lila fled to school, unable to stay. So I got out of bed and walked myself to school, something I was usually too scared to do, but not nearly as scared as I was of whatever was in my home. They moved out soon after, and the terror stopped. We moved out of the home shortly after, due to my mom getting married, and all related activities stopped, much to my relief. The house's shadow lingered in Lila's mind. A question unanswered. Why her? The presence had chosen her. Its actions personal, its voice intimate. She never returned, but the memory of that room, that blanket, that voice stayed with her. A reminder that some homes are not meant to be claimed. Story number 28. The house was too quiet. The kind of silence that hums with secret, older than its walls. 11-year-old Lucas lay in his bed. The darkness of his remote Canadian home pressing against him like a heavy blanket. His bedroom, at the end of a long hallway, felt like a trap, its door a thin barrier against the night. He woke up in the middle of the night and heard something repeatedly running up and down the hallway. The sound was light, rapid, like a child's bare feet darting across the floorboards. Too swift to be human, something was out there, aware of him, and Lucas felt its presence like a cold hand on his heart. The footsteps weren't his mother's. She was asleep. The only other soul in the house, they sounded lightweight and rapid, like a scampering toddler. With no pets in the household, Lucas sat upright, his breath shallow, eyes locked on the door as the steps raced back and forth. Every time they reached the end where his bedroom was, there was a momentary pause before resuming. The pause felt deliberate, as if whatever was out there knew he was listening, waiting for him to react. The cycle repeated for about 5 minutes, then abruptly ceased. Lucas remained frozen, too terrified to move, his mind racing with questions. What was it, and why did it stop? He got a distinct feeling that whatever it was seemed to be aware that he was aware of its presence. The house, perched in a northwestern Canadian city, stood on land heavy with history, once an indigenous village raised by colonizers in 1930. Lucas learned this later, the weight of that knowledge adding a chill to his memory. Years passed, but the sound of those footsteps lingered, a rhythm that haunted his dreams. Another night, older now, Lucas ventured into the basement workshop, the air thick with dust and shadows. He reached for tools on the pegboard, his focus narrow, when a female voice growled in his ear, sharp and venomous. A female voice aggressively growled directly into his left ear, sending him into a panic, dropping everything and sprinting up the stairs. The growl wasn't human. It was too raw, too close, as if it came from within the air itself. The incident was far more traumatic than the footsteps, leaving an icy chill throughout his body. Lucas's heart pounded as he fled, the basement door slamming behind him, the house's silence now a mocking presence. He never returned to the workshop alone, his courage shaken by that unseen voice. The land's history gnawed at him. Stories of the village's destruction, of spirits unrested by violence. The neighborhood was on land once inhabited by indigenous villages, burnt to the ground in 913 by British colonizers to annex the land. Was that growl a remnant of that pain, a spirit tied to the earth? Lucas moved away as an adult, but the house's echoes followed him. He avoided dark hallways, his sleep broken by memories of scampering feet and that guttural voice. Research into the area revealed tales of unrested spirits, whispers of children lost in the fire, their presence lingering in the soil. Lucas tried sage, prayers, anything to cleanse the house. But the air remained heavy, as if the spirits refused to leave. He shared his story with friends, who spoke of similar chills in old homes, but none matched the intensity of his encounters. The house still stands, its hallway silent now. But Lucas knew something still ran its length, pausing at his door, forever aware.